Hi there, this is Sioux McKenna and I'm going to be chatting to you about institutional differentiation. In most higher education sectors around the world, there's an attempt to ensure differentiation. That is, an attempt to have different kinds of universities offering different kinds of programs. This is seen as a great strength in a national higher education sector because you can then have universities that focus on very particular kinds of qualifications. In 1994, there were 36 public universities in South Africa, and these needed to be reduced, largely because of the mass duplication of courses because universities were constructed around the racist ideology of apartheid, whereby each institution served a different ethnic and racial group. Furthermore, the different universities were treated extremely differently in terms of what funding they received, and in terms of the kinds of programs they could offer, and in terms of the extent to which they had freedom to direct for themselves what it is that they did. This highly uneven sector was rearranged through a series of mergers and amalgamations, which took the numbers down from 36 to 23. It has subsequently gone back up to 26. The colonial and apartheid legacy remains evident in every possible aspect of higher education. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment and thinking through the ways in which your current context, in which you are undertaking postgraduate supervision, is structured by this legacy. We had two kinds of differentiation in the apartheid years. There was differentiation based on race, and there was differentiation based on type. Let's first consider this kind of differentiation based on race. It would be easy to assume that all the mergers and amalgamations which were intended to unsettle and reform the higher education landscape mean that differentiation based on past is an issue of the past. But of course it isn't. And it's worth thinking through what is in the past and what thinking, processes, structures, cultures continue to permeate the ways in which we act, treat each other, processes we follow, the very hierarchical nature of our university. All of those things emerge from the histories of our institutions. So when we reflect on our own supervision practice, it's really important to reflect upon where we are doing that supervision and how it is that the institutional structures and cultures impact on what we can and cannot do, and to think through how our current institutional cultures and structures actually emerge from these histories. It's also worth thinking through the difference between the racial differentiation of the past and the racial differentiation of the present. Bunting and Cooper are good authors to read if you'd like to consider these issues in more detail. Here we have the list of institutions that are currently designated as historically black institutions or historically disadvantaged universities, if you prefer. But as well as the differentiation of race, there was also differentiation under apartheid based on type. And we had what is commonly known as the binary divide of technikons and universities. And it was a divide. It was not a continuum of institutions. You had technikons on one side and universities on the other. And just as we saw with the differentiation on race, there were extreme differences in these institutions in terms of their structures, their cultures, their funding, and so on. Amongst the many distinctions that existed included the kinds of programs they could offer. The funding was run differently. The qualification levels of staff, typically staff were appointed on the basis of workplace expertise, and they didn't need to have very high-level academic qualifications. In technikons, there was no postgraduate study for most of the technikon history. Only towards the end of that history did they start offering postgraduate qualifications, and there was very little, if any, research produced. They had CERTEC and advisory boards, which meant that there was more control over qualifications in the technikon sector, much stronger state control in the technikon sector than in the traditional universities. So in many ways, the historically black universities and the technikons were very similar in the extent to which they were monitored and controlled by the apartheid government. There was also a difference in curriculum structures, with universities typically offering formative qualifications, with students packaging together their own qualification within big categories such as BA or BSc, whereas the diploma structure was much more structured. You came in to complete a prescribed curriculum, and that was prescribed and overseen by the state, with very little freedom within institutions to develop their own curriculum. There was a convenership system whereby one technikon was allocated by the state to develop a curriculum. The state then approved it, and all technikons that offered that program would then offer a national diploma. And so there was very little power within institutions to engage in curricula, and there was very little power of the agency of individual academics. And here we have the universities of technology. So at the time of all the mergers, technikons changed into universities of technology. So these two processes overlapped. And one of the ideas of having this new three-part classification of universities, traditional universities, comprehensive universities, and universities of technologies, was this idea that there should be better articulation between types of institution. So the Committee of Technikon Principals called for the change from the name Technikon to University of Technology, and Minister Asmal approved it, but there were a number of implications for institutions. Then we had the formation of the Comprehensive University, which is a combination of University of Technology and traditional university. Most were formed through mergers of institutions, but University of Venda and University of Zululand did not merge with any other institution. So they were traditional universities and they were told to become comprehensive, whereas the others were a blend of traditional university plus technikon to form this new animal, the comprehensive university. They were meant to allow for better articulation of students between University of Technology type programs and traditional. They were meant to ensure a spread of offering within a particular geographical area, and they were meant to be 70% University of Technology type programs, but that is not what has happened at all. And there have been questions asked about the fact that there was no understanding or no articulation of how, if you are teaching a particular form of knowledge, you would need to do so in a particular way, and you would have a particular academic identity, and that it's not a simple matter to go from teaching in a diploma to teaching in a degree and back and forth and back and forth, that these are fundamentally different things. And then we have the third group, which is the traditional universities, and I think one of the things you can see straight away here is this no merger, no merger, no merger. So mergers are very unsettling. Any of you who lived through them will know that they are very complicated, politically volatile, difficult processes. And there was a general sense that those universities that produced the bulk, by far the bulk of the research, was produced by the handful of universities at the top of the slide. And there was a sense that as South Africa was coming out of academic isolation and moving into this so-called knowledge economy, that mergers would unsettle these institutions that we were relying on to produce the knowledge needed for this knowledge economy. And so that there was a national decision that it was too much of a risk to put these universities through mergers that would prevent them providing the very necessary knowledge for the knowledge economy. But of course, the other side of that argument is that simply re-entrenched their privilege, because these were institutions that had long enjoyed a lot of institutional freedom, far greater funding, that had built up postgraduate environments over decades. And so the fact that the others had to sustain mergers, and these did not, actually reinforced the very unevenness that the mergers were meant to undo. So there are very different points of view on this particular issue. Also, just to note that there are a number of private higher education institutions in South Africa, and these are growing very rapidly. About 10% of our graduates every year come from private institutions. And there's over 100 private institutions in South Africa, but most are very small. A lot of them are in business world. They do have to follow exactly the same quality assurance measures as public universities. They have to get their programs accredited. They have to have institutional audits. Very few private higher education institutions offer postgraduate, but they are starting to do so, all the way up to doctoral level, which is why there are some private institutions that are part of the current National Review of Doctorates. So what does all this mean for your role as supervisors? One of the key things we're trying to do in this course is to show the need for you to develop your own research identity and your own supervision practices, but to understand that you do that within a context, and that it's really important to have an understanding of that context and to reflect on that context in order to become the best supervisor you can be. And that means an understanding that the history of the institution in which you are working in and the kinds of differentiation that we see in the sector has implications for who you are and what you do. For example, you may be in a research-rich institution, or you may be in an institution with very low research output. And that has enormous consequences for your supervision practice. If you are in a research-rich institution, almost every lunch hour there will be some guest lecture or seminar or workshop. There will be all number of activities geared towards research that you can send your students to. There will be conversations in the staff room around people's research interests, which can help to support you as a supervisor and researcher. Whereas if you're in an institution with a low research output, you may find you're the only one in your department doing research. You will not necessarily have the easy collegial support of others, and you may need to seek that out. And you may find that the burden of supervision on you is much stronger because you cannot encourage your student to participate in short courses and seminars and workshops happening on campus, which would help to develop the student's research identity. The history of your institution. You may be in an institution that has long enjoyed a fair amount of institutional autonomy and academic freedom, where you have a lot more power with your colleagues to decide what to do and how to do it, versus institutions that are very hierarchical, that have a long history of compliance with rules, strong managerialism, so there may be a lot of bureaucracy, there may be a lot of paperwork, there may be a sense that everything you do is being performance managed rather than developed and supported. Those kinds of issues of institutional culture have a huge effect on supervisors. Workloads differ significantly across different institutions. Universities of technology typically have very high lecture loads. The kinds of knowledge that they're producing is often very hands-on, requiring a lot of studio and laboratory practice work. And in a traditional university, there's more likely to be a lower level of lecturing, although of course it differs significantly by different disciplines. And there's also that as a sector in South Africa, we still follow very colonial supervision models. There is a video you can watch on models of supervision. But in particular, at doctoral level, our higher education qualification sub-framework says that coursework cannot be for credit, which means that very few doctoral programs include coursework, even though that's very much the norm in most parts of the world. And especially in humanities and social sciences, there's this dominance of the one-on-one model. So this is also part of our legacy. And if you watch the models of supervision video, you will hopefully start to understand that what we take to be normal practice is actually a historical structure or culture. And so once you start to understand your context in terms of history, we start to see that things are not common sense or normal, that they actually emerge from the political, cultural, social histories of our institutions and sector. I hope that was useful. Thanks for listening.